Welcome to lesson 14, showing us the business BO status enter example. In fact, we have a few examples in the system. If I actually go to my application here, we can see within the BO, and we've seen most of these BOs at work, these status enter algorithms at work. So let's just summarize them by looking at the the life cycle. And if I look at the validating step, we have check existence, and this checks to see whether there is an existing user in the users already, and if it does, then it actually brings it back, and you can update that user. So this particular algorithm is found over here. I'm going to have a look at it now. And you will see that we have, again, a different algorithm spot. And we get the next status coming up. We have the transition condition. We set if we want, we can set the next default status, and in this case we are going to be setting the next status and using that. And we also get the BO key, obviously, in the BO that we can work with. So the first thing that we do is the next status is null. We're not going to use the next default status, but if we actually find that we have an existing user in the system, then we will actually move it to a different status, and we will not use the default next status. So the next status is default next status is true. And what we do is we get the key and we find the ID in the system, and it says if the ID already exists, if I can actually find the ID and the ID already exists in the system. Okay, so now I get the string back, and then I see whether the ID exists. Then, if it doesn't exist, then I will actually, if it doesn't exist, it means it's not null. I apologize. If it's not null, then what I will do is simply update the path using the BO instance to say that the user type already exists in the system, and then I will update the BO. And then I will set the next status, not to use the default one, but to use the update status instead. So that corresponds to, if I go into my example over here, and I have an existing user. Just putting some garbage here. It's when now I check. It's now that I click on check for existing user in the next, that it's going to fire that algorithm, that plugin, and it's going to come back with an existing user, my user in the system, and set that to be existing user with the name. And that's these two fields which have been filled in, these two elements which have been added, actually correspond to the two elements that I've set over here to update the business object. And instead of using the default next status, it's changing the next status to be now ready to update. And that ready to update is shown over here. Updates. New status code is going to be update status. So that is the first example that we have of a BO status enter. Now once we do that, we also create, and in this example you will see that we have created a log. We have created a log, and a log has a to-do, and that's because that we have on the business object and enter here, add approval to do and log. And this is that's the second algorithm that I want to have a look at, and it's this one over here. So it has the same interface, and in this case, in the invoke, what we're going to do is we get the user setup process, we go and get the type, because from the type we're going to get a to-do type and role, which is actually found on the type. So if I actually go to my if I go to the user setup process type, you will see that we have a approval to do and role, and that is actually going to be retrieved over here. We're going to get the user setup process type entity, and from the entity we get the we read the BO. And the reason why we read the BO is because when we don't get it directly to the DTO is because it's found, this data is found in the CLOB, and we get a to-do type and a to-do role. And using the to-do and to-do role, we're actually going to first of all check to see if there's any existing to-dos, and then we create a new to-do and add a log. So we actually do a query here, an example that we saw before, how we query data, and here we're querying it using Hibernate. And if there are no existing to-dos, then we are going to create a new to-do. And then creation of the to-do is used using a DTO directly, using the entity. And it fills in the drill keys and the sort keys, and messages. It uses something called a creator. It uses a factory method, which is found, a to-do creator, which makes it easier, sort of like helper method, helper class to help us create the to-do, and creates the to-do that way. And similarly as well, we retrieve actually before that the messages category and number from the to-do type. So if I go to the to-do type, you will see that we have a message category and number, and these are the ones which I'm picking up. And it's the ones which we're going to use to create the new to-do. And here we use, similarly as well, we're using a helper, so a MO log helper to create a new log. Also have a separate way of querying the database. I actually have both methods I mentioned before. In earlier lesson that we can actually do that via a entity using Hibernate, or we can do a pass-through query. So I have another example doing it that way as well, which I'm not using in this particular example, but the code is there, the method is there. Finally, we have, if I go back to the user process, we can actually create or update the user, and that's done by a third enter status on the final state, on the final status. So I can update the existing user, and now you see that the name has been updated, and that has been done by the create user or update user. If we have a look at what we're doing over here, we're basically checking to see whether the user ID has been updated on the BO. If you remember that if we actually have a existing user, we update it with the exists and the user ID, and it's checking for that over here. And if it actually doesn't exist, then we create a new user. Otherwise, we will update the user. And this is a good example, by the way. I'm using in the create user, I'm using the DTO to actually create the user. I have something called start changes and end changes, and that actually puts off the start changes, end changes, basically adds the data as one entity transaction without actually firing the change handlers. So that actually controls if I haven't completely completed my entity until everything has been set up. I can use a start changes, and at the end I have a save changes, and that allows that the change handlers only fire at the end. And I'm going through and adding in the to-do roles and everything that is needed, picking up this information from the BO type. And again, all this has been done using the DTO. So that's how I do it with the create user. I'm not going through every line by line. It's most probably enough just that you should get the general principle. And then when you can look through the actual code itself, you have a better idea how, for example, we go through looping and so on and so forth. Some of the difficulties sometimes be able to create these things are creating the IDs in the right way and making sure that you know how that works in the correct method. And you need to look at the library and the Java docs to actually see how that works. Once you actually have done, once I've done that, I do a fast update in this case to say that I have an existing, if I don't have an existing user, I'm updating showing that it's a new user, and now I'm setting the user ID on the BO. Now when I update the user, I'm doing it in a different way. I'm not using the DTO here, I'm using the business object. I'm using the business object instance, and the reason why I'm using BO in this case, first of all, is to show you the two different methods of updating the data here using the BO. But another reason for that is that it actually has a very useful dispatcher method called replace. I don't actually have to worry about if I have slight changes in all the different roles and user groups. As long as I put in the updated instance of the BO, it handles everything without me needing to delete everything and recreate it. So therefore the replace method is very useful, and therefore I've done the update by a business object dispatcher using the replace. So those are three examples of enter status algorithms. Again, we have one for checking to see whether an existing user is in the system. It then updates and adds the ID. And then there's a creation of a to-do and a log. And then finally we have the create user, which also creates and also updates. The creation is done through the DTO, and the update is done through a BO dispatcher. So those are our examples, and again, just to make a comparison between the Java methods, the interface there, we see that we are basically, in this particular case, not using any of the input, the output methods are not actually that useful necessarily. The next status is sometimes, but for example, when we create the new user or update the user, we don't need to we're handling things outside by creating a new user, and we don't have to hand something off as the output. But you see that the Java inputs and outputs and the config ones, config tools do correspond.